The explosion had barely stopped ringing in Carl Meissner's ears when the U-571 jolted beneath him, a deep groan vibrating through the iron bones of the submarine like a wounded animal. Smoke hissed from a cracked vent overhead, curling in gray ribbons across the dim compartment. His palms, slick with oil and seawater, gripped the side of the warped bulkhead as another creak reverberated through the vessel's hull. Lights flickered. Somewhere near the stern, a pipe burst with a hiss of steam, followed by a short, panicked yell. Then silence. His heart pounded beneath his wool tunic, each beat like the rattle of the enemy's destroyer guns still echoing in his mind. For a moment, Carl couldn't tell if they had surfaced by command or by damage. All he knew was that the U-boat was no longer diving. They were no longer hunters. They were prey, exposed, rattled, and listing in the Atlantic waves like a dying whale. Someone banged open the main hatch above. The conning tower had breached the surface. "Up!" "All of you now," came the order from Oberleutnant Maurer, voice hoarse and broken, yet trying to sound commanding. "Abandon your posts. We are surfacing. That's an order." Carl hesitated, fingers tightening against the bulkhead. His thoughts raced. Would they be gunned down the moment they emerged? He'd heard stories. Americans didn't take prisoners. At least, that's what the officers back in Kiel had said, rumors woven with fear, meant to steal their resolve. But the hatch was open now, and sunlight, blinding, white and cold, streamed down like judgment. Carl climbed the ladder last, boots slipping slightly on damp iron. As he emerged onto the deck, the full shape of the destroyer came into view. Towering over their crippled submarine like a floating fortress, the American warship cut the waves with mechanical precision. It bore no insignia Carl could read, just the blocky identification numbers on its hull and the angled shadows of sailors lining its rails. Every gun was silent, every sailor watching. He expected shouting, maybe rifle barrels trained at their heads. Instead, the silence was worse, thick, cautious, heavy with judgment. The Americans stood still, watching as the German crew, soot-streaked and coughing, filed out onto the deck with hands raised. Carl's knees nearly gave as he stepped onto the metal surface. The submarine shifted again beneath him, still groaning, and he reached instinctively for balance before a sailor on the American ship called out, "Hands where I can see them." "Keep them up." The order was sharp, but not shouted. The voice came from a young man, maybe not much older than Carl himself, dressed in a navy blue uniform and flanked by two others with rifles slung across their backs. The Germans obeyed. There were fewer of them now, 28, maybe 30 left from a crew of nearly 50. The others were gone, lost below, trapped behind the torpedo bulkhead. Carl swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. His mind tried to remember their names, but failed. They were gone, and it was over. One American sailor approached with a canteen in his hand. He offered it, wordlessly, to the first in line. The German, a radio man named Keller, stared at it as though it were a live grenade. "You want it or not?" the American asked. He didn't smile. His face was sun-worn, serious. Keller reached out slowly and took the canteen. Others followed. One by one, the Germans drank, not too much, just enough to wet their throats and remind them they were still alive. When it reached Carl, he hesitated. His lips trembled. He hadn't tasted fresh water in hours. The air inside the U-571 had been heavy with oil, blood, and fear. But this moment, was something else. Water from the hands of an enemy. His fingers touched the cool metal, and for the first time, he looked at the sailor's face. Young, calm, and cautious. The kind of caution that didn't come from hatred, but from wariness, from protocol. Carl took a sip. By the time they were searched and lined up on the American deck, the questions began. Name? Rank? Specialty? They answered with the flatness of soldiers. There was no screaming, no blows, just firm hands and detailed notes. Carl was tagged, photographed with a boxy American camera, and loaded onto a steel-hulled transport ship, gray, towering and loud with the groan of winches and orders barked in English. Inside the dim hold, he found a spot near the wall, sinking down against the cold steel. His fingers twitched. His mind still raced with engine sounds and sonar pings that weren't there. Somewhere nearby, someone cried. Quietly. Just once. Then stopped. Over the next few days, they were fed. Not well, but fed. Bread, broth, water, sometimes bitter coffee. The American guards said little, but they didn't mock. They watched. They kept their distance. At night, Carl pressed charcoal from the engine deck into scraps of wrapping paper and wrote, just fragments, memories, names, dreams. He didn't know why. Then, one afternoon, a man in a khaki uniform walked in carrying a canvas pouch. He barked something in English. One of the German prisoners translated, "Forms. From the Red Cross, we are allowed to write letters. To home." A hush spread. Disbelief. Carl took the offered paper as though it were counterfeit. "Is this a trick?" he whispered to his bunkmate, Dieter, a thin stoker with grease still in the creases of his hands. Dieter shook his head slowly. "They say it's real." Carl stared down at the paper. His fingers trembled. He could see the faint watermark of the Red Cross, the ruled lines, the boxes for name and address. He still didn't trust it. His mouth felt dry again. "We are allowed." "To write?" he repeated, barely audible. Across the hold, someone had already begun scribbling. Another was holding the form like it might vanish. He reached for the pencil, carefully printed the name of his mother, then paused. What could he possibly say? That he was alive? That he'd seen kindness in a place he thought would bring death? And yet, the guards didn't rush him. They waited. They collected the letters. They gave envelopes. As he folded the page, something shifted inside him. He looked around the hold, not at enemies, but at other boys in gray uniforms. Boys who'd been told that capture was shame and that the enemy would treat them like animals. But here they were, alive, bruised, cold, confused, and writing home. The Americans had metal ships, yes, but it was their mercy that cut deepest. It wasn't the silence of the submarine that broke us. It was the quiet kindness above the water. Corporal Thomas Bellamy froze mid-sentence, his pen hovering over the form like a guillotine suspended above a prisoner's neck. "Is Friedrich feeding my pigeons?" the letter asked. Bellamy blinked. The words didn't match the rest of the page. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, like someone copying a prayer from memory. Most letters followed a dull pattern. Name, date, health update, hopes for peace, and sometimes a bland description of camp routines. But this one-line question, held something else. He leaned back in his creaking folding chair, the cheap steel legs scraping faintly against the concrete floor of the Leavenworth Mail Review Center. The room smelled of stale coffee, pencil shavings, and military soap. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, flickering slightly as if unsure they wanted to stay on. Around him, rows of identical desks stretched toward the far wall, each occupied by silent men scanning, marking, sorting. Their shoulders sagged under the weight of routine. Bellamy wasn't supposed to feel anything. That had been drilled into him from his first day in intelligence monitoring. "You're not reading letters," Major Halverson had barked during training. "You're reading threats. Spy ink. Subtle code. Assume every sentence is a disguise." Still, that pigeon line clung to him. He reached for the next envelope, trying to shake the feeling, but his fingers hesitated over the seal. He could still hear Halverson's voice earlier that morning, complaining over breakfast rations. "They're clever, Bellamy," the major had said, smearing jam over his dry toast like it owed him something. "The Germans know we've got soft spots. They'll cry about homesickness, mothers, lost dogs. It's all bait." Bellamy hadn't replied. He never argued with Halverson, but he remembered what it felt like the first time he saw a letter addressed to Muti. There had been no military jargon, just longing, plain and raw. By nightfall, the letters began to blur. Line after line of familiar phrases. I am well. Please tell Uncle Gustav I miss him. The Americans treat us tolerably. Then he found Otto's letter. The handwriting was sloppier than most. Ink smudged near the fold. A grease stain at the corner, probably from a pocket shared with a wrench. Bellamy read slowly. The food tastes of engine grease, Otto had written, but they let me write to you. That is stranger than any weapon. Bellamy stopped breathing for a second. Stranger than any weapon. What did that mean? He glanced around. The other monitors were absorbed in their stacks. No one noticed as he reread the line. 3 times. Something about the sentence, its mix of sarcasm and sincerity, pierced deeper than the formal greetings or dramatic appeals. Otto hadn't begged for mercy. He hadn't asked for news from the Reich. He'd simply stated a truth. The permission to write home felt more foreign than war machines. Bellamy stared at the censor flag stamp beside him. His job was simple. Flag anything that sounded suspicious or used unusual phrasing. Normally, stranger than any weapon might earn a mark. It could be metaphor. It could be code. But Bellamy didn't believe it was. He pictured the young torpedo man, oil-streaked fingers, humming while scrawling in a drafty bunkhouse. Maybe he'd tuck the letter under his mattress until mail day. Maybe he reread it 10 times before handing it over, whispering his mother's name like a shield. Bellamy slowly slipped the page into the approved stack. He didn't stamp it. He didn't mark it for review. When the shift ended, Bellamy walked past Major Halverson's office, nodding without stopping. The major didn't notice. He was too busy scowling at a radio broadcast. Outside, the Kansas air was crisp, the kind of night that made the windows rattle and the moon look sharper than usual. Bellamy lit a cigarette but didn't smoke it. He just watched the ember glow as the wind tugged at his coat. They trained me to find secrets in ink, but sometimes all I saw was someone missing his mother. Hey, Fritz, ever seen a carrot that's not boiled to death? The voice came sharp and mocking, slicing through the steam and chatter of the mess hall. Lucas Frey froze mid-step, his metal tray trembling slightly in his hands. His eyes darted toward the source, a tall American soldier with a crooked grin, balancing a bowl of chili in one hand and pointing with the other. Laughter followed, not cruel but loud, bouncing off the walls like ricocheted bullets. Another GI behind the soup counter leaned into the performance, snapping his heels together with an exaggerated goose step, ladle raised like a rifle. Schnell, march to the meatloaf, Herr Kommandant, he barked in a faux German accent before collapsing into giggles with the others nearby. Lucas didn't understand why they laughed. He didn't understand the joke or the tone. His face stayed blank, jaw set, fingers clenching the tray tighter. The scent of baked beans, overcooked cabbage, and warm bread filled the air, but he felt none of it didn't make sense. None of it. Lucas stepped forward, avoiding the grins, trying not to flinch as a GI leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry, Fritz. The Jell-O doesn't bite." Another laugh. Lucas didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the floor and moved through the line, collecting whatever was handed to him, a lump of mashed potatoes, a scoop of spinach, a slice of dry cornbread. He sat alone at the end of a long wooden table, flanked by the absence of his fellow prisoners who'd already eaten earlier. He cut his food silently, chewing without taste. Around him, noise swelled. The Americans were loud. They clinked glasses, shouted across tables, even threw wadded napkins like snowballs. It wasn't disorder, it was something else. Something foreign. They weren't just eating. They were enjoying. A few minutes in, his stomach twisted, not from food, but from confusion. Why did the guards allow this behavior? Why were black men and white men eating together like equals? Why were the cooks joking with officers? Across the room, a figure watched it. Not the warmth, not the hunger, just the eyes on him. Back in Stuttgart, laughter during meals was rare. Discipline ruled the table. Uniforms were inspected, backs straightened, and voices kept low. Food was functional, boiled, portioned, plain. This mess hall was chaos. A black cook in a grease-stained apron danced behind the serving line, spinning with a slotted spoon like it was a jazz baton. A white corporal and a black private shared a newspaper at one table, pointing at cartoons and chuckling. A bright red poster, haphazardly taped above the drink station, read, "Meatless Monday," in uneven handwriting, as if scrawled by a child. Reggie, one of the black guards, stood near the far entrance, arms crossed, a calm stillness about him that contrasted the mess hall's motion. He wasn't laughing. His gaze followed Lucas quietly, as if studying more than supervising. Later that night, as the lights dimmed and prisoners were shuffled back toward their bunks, Lucas lingered near the corner of the hallway where guards checked head counts. His boots scuffed softly against the cement as he walked, trying to process what he'd seen. Reggie approached him then, tall, silent, carrying something in his hand. Without a word, he held out an apple. Not a bruised, leftover one from rations, but a fresh red apple that gleamed under the hallway bulb. Lucas stared at it. He didn't move. "You don't have to be stiff to stand tall," Reggie said quietly, his voice low, eyes steady. Lucas's hands didn't reach for the apple right away. He wasn't sure if it was a challenge, a trick, or something else. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but confusion. Back home, rules were sharp and kindness rare. Here, nothing followed the rules he'd been taught. He finally took the apple. It felt heavier than it should. Reggie nodded once, turned, and walked away. Lucas stood in the hallway, apple in hand, unable to speak. The air felt different somehow, thicker, but not with fear, with questions. Neither boot camp nor battle had prepared him for kindness wrapped in humor. "They didn't break us with bullets. They confused us with freedom." The gate clanged shut behind him. Henri Lambert didn't flinch. He adjusted the strap of his clipboard, stepped over a patch of hardened Wyoming frost, and crossed the compound yard with calm precision. Camp Washburn was quieter than most of the American-run POW facilities he had visited. The barracks stood in tidy rows, the mess hall chimney leaked pale smoke, and a few German prisoners raked gravel under the watch of a drowsy guard. But Lambert had learned not to trust quiet. Quiet was where things hid. "Name and purpose," barked a young American corporal at the checkpoint. "Inspector Henri Lambert, International Committee of the Red Cross," he replied in clipped English, presenting his badge and a letter from Geneva. His French accent curled slightly at the edges of his words. The corporal squinted at the papers, then waved him through. "Major Downs'll want to see you." "I'm sure he will," Lambert said, stepping forward before the gate could clang again behind him. Major Downs met him near the main office, flanked by 2 lieutenants and a Sergeant Lowell, an aging, red-faced man whose breath smelled faintly of tobacco and disdain. "We've got no beatings, no starvation, nothing to see here," Lowell said before introductions were even exchanged. Lambert blinked twice. He always blinked before speaking. It wasn't a nervous tic, more a ritual. "That's good," he said quietly, in German this time, "but I'll be verifying for myself." Lowell scoffed. "Suit yourself, Inspector." Lambert began with the barracks. He walked the narrow aisles between bunks, noting the thin mattresses, the wool blankets folded with obsessive neatness. The prisoners stood stiffly at attention, unsure whether to fear or welcome the foreigner with the clipboard. Lambert's eyes landed on one, a young man, no older than 20, with a bandaged hand and hollow cheeks. "Wie lange ist es her?" Lambert asked, pointing to the bandage. 3 days, the boy replied, surprised to be spoken to in his own language. "Burned it in the kitchen." Lambert scribbled a note. No antiseptic, no follow-up, no file on record. In the mess hall, the cooks greeted him with exaggerated cheer, stirring enormous pots of soup that smelled watery and thin. He made a mental note of the posted calorie count. It was legal. Barely. But it was the mailroom that made him stop cold. Lambert stepped inside the cramped office, its walls lined with sorting bins and rusted filing cabinets. A lone sergeant behind the desk was thumbing lazily through a deck of playing cards, boots propped on a crate of unopened packages. "I'll need to see the log," Lambert said. The sergeant hesitated. "The log?" Lambert blinked twice, slower this time. He moved past the desk, crouched, and opened the crate beside the man's feet. Letters, dozens of them, unopened, unsorted, some dated over 3 weeks ago. He pulled out a Red Cross envelope addressed to a German family in Dresden, another to Hamburg. Another, smeared with rain damage, had already begun to disintegrate. "These should have been forwarded," Lambert said, voice low and sharp. "We thought they might be encoded," the sergeant muttered, suddenly unsure of his boot's comfort. "And so you left them to rot." Lambert's fingers gripped the edge of the crate. "The Red Cross inspects these letters before shipment. If you suspect codes, you notify us." "Not let them sit." The sergeant opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Lambert stood slowly. His expression remained composed, but his eyes were steel. The next day he requested private interviews with select prisoners. Among them was a gaunt German lieutenant named Friedrich Brandt. When Brandt entered the narrow room, he walked as if under invisible chains. Lambert gestured for him to sit, then slid a fresh Red Cross form across the table. "You may write to your family." Brandt's fingers trembled as they touched the paper. "Is this truly allowed?" "It is not only allowed," Lambert said. "It is promised. I will ensure it reaches Geneva myself." Brandt's lips parted, but he didn't speak. He simply nodded, eyes wet. When the interviews were done and the inspection concluded, Lambert returned to his quarters and began writing his report. He documented everything: rations, interviews, the mail delay, the lack of medical care. But the longest section was about the unopened letters. He knew most would see it as paperwork, minor logistics, but he had watched the faces of men who had not heard from their families in months. He had watched their hope decay like paper under a boot. That winter, his report would reach Geneva. It would trigger a new policy: random audits of all American camps' mailrooms, oversight that would ripple across the continent, far beyond Camp Washburn. He folded the report, sealed it, and handed it off to the courier with no ceremony. Sometimes the most dangerous silence isn't in battle, it's in the mailroom. The pen slipped from Hans Becker's hand the moment the translator finished his sentence. "It's not you," the man had said gently, his British accent softened by something close to pity. "We found out the city center of Essen was bombed flat in February. The postal office, too." Hans didn't respond. He didn't blink. He simply stood there in the shadow of the cattle barn, frozen in place, one hand gripping the edge of a wooden beam as if letting go would send him tumbling through the floor. The late spring wind moved around him, tugging at the sleeves of his faded work shirt. A cow lowed somewhere behind the fence. The translator, Corporal Mason, a lanky man with wireframe glasses and dirt-smudged boots, shifted awkwardly before clearing his throat and walking away. The pen lay in the dirt. Hans knelt slowly, not to pick it up, but because his knees buckled. His fingers curled into the soil, still warm from the sun and rich with the scent of manure and hay. The earth didn't care what was written or destroyed. It only absorbed. For 21 straight weeks, Hans had written. Every Tuesday afternoon after roll call, the guards at the converted French farmhouse, now a labor outpost, would hand out single-page Red Cross stationery, stamped and numbered. Each prisoner was allowed one sheet. No folded corners, no drawings, no political opinions. Just space enough for reassurance, longing, and the occasional coded memory that might make it past the censors. His first letters had brimmed with energy. "I am safe," he wrote. "The Americans give us bread with jam. Real jam." He joked about the clumsy way the French overseer said Becker, like baguette. He told his younger brother to hide the bicycle tubes from their cousin Max, who always stole them for slingshots. He asked his mother about the garden. Were the tomatoes still climbing the trellis? Was the neighbor's rooster still waking them too early? No answers came. After 5 weeks, his handwriting grew tighter, more hesitant. By the 10th, he stopped asking questions. By the 15th, he addressed only one person, his mother, and ended each note with the same 3 words: "I am waiting." Hans had blamed censors. He blamed slow mail, shifting borders, translation delays. When other men received responses, yellowed envelopes stamped from Hamburg, Stuttgart, even Leipzig, he smiled for them, genuinely. But inside, a shadow took root. Doubt, like mold, thrived in silence. Until now. Bombed flat. He replayed the phrase again and again as he walked through the rows of furrowed soil that evening, hands empty, boots dragging. The barn loomed behind him, black against the horizon. Stars pricked the sky overhead, but none of them looked familiar. Nothing did. The French farmers who'd once owned this land were gone. The locals barely made eye contact. The American guards, though not cruel, kept a line of distance that no shared laugh could cross. Hans was surrounded by people, but entirely alone. That night, he sat on the low cot in his shed and stared at the blank Red Cross form in his lap. The ink bottle trembled in his hand. He could still write. But what was the point? He dipped the pen anyway. The page remained untouched for several minutes. Then he wrote, "Today I learned that Essen may be gone." He paused. "I hope this letter finds someone. Anyone." He folded the sheet carefully and handed it to the corporal the next morning without a word. The soldier took it without looking. Weeks later, Hans would return to the same question in his mind. If a letter is sent but its reader no longer exists, does it still count as hope? But for now, he stood silently in the pale light of dawn, watching a guard collect forms from other prisoners, the sound of rustling paper loud against the quiet. The ink was still wet when Hans turned away. A letter can reach across oceans, but not through ashes. Lieutenant James Whittaker slammed the thick folder shut with a thud that echoed through the bare concrete office. Dust leapt from the pages as if startled by his frustration. The words inside the intelligence report churned in his mind. POW morale dangerously high. Excessive leniency. Potential for coordinated escape. He pushed back his chair, its metal legs screeching against the floor, and stood motionless for a moment, staring at the sliver of light cutting through the high window. It was snowing outside, flakes drifting down like ash. Silent, slow, indifferent. He had just returned from Camp Brookvale. What he'd seen there wasn't high morale. It was desperation, barely hidden under the thinnest veil of routine. The camp doctor, a red-eyed man named Levitt, had resorted to treating festering wounds with salt water. Supplies were low, and medical shipments had been delayed for weeks. A skeletal prisoner with sunken cheeks had knelt at the edge of the infirmary cot, whispering, "Bitte. Penicillin. Bitte." But there was none. The camp's guard tower looked sturdy from a distance, but inside the guards muttered in shame. One of them couldn't meet Whittaker's eyes when he mentioned the suicide that occurred 2 nights before. The man, an artilleryman from Kiel, had tied his belt to the pipe above his bunk. Quiet. No note. Whittaker hadn't spoken during the drive back. The snow had begun that morning, blanketing the landscape in a deceptive calm. In the back seat of the Jeep, he reviewed his notes again and again, hoping the ink would rearrange itself into something more hopeful. It never did. Now, in the office of Central Command's Internal Review Wing, he faced another kind of cold. Institutional denial. Colonel Barnes barely glanced up when Whittaker entered. He was reading a dispatch and chewing on the end of an unlit cigar. "I'm submitting a revision," Whitaker said, placing his typed correction on the desk. "The situation at Camp Brookvale doesn't match the report." Barnes sighed and leaned back in his leather chair. "James," he said slowly, "you're still young. Eager to clean the windows, even if it means smearing the glass." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, the data in this report is misleading. There's no chocolate, no staged theater, and morale isn't high. It's threadbare. They're surviving, not plotting." Barnes removed the cigar and set it gently in a tray. "But that's not how command needs to see it right now. You start sending around reports that make it look like we're failing to maintain discipline, and heads start rolling. Politically, strategically. Do you understand?" "I understand what's convenient," Whitaker said, voice low, "but not what's true." Silence lingered. Outside the window, the wind dragged flurries sideways across the courtyard. Inside, the radiator hissed, the only sound between them. Colonel Barnes picked up Whitaker's correction and thumbed through it lazily. "Look, your heart's in the right place. But this?" He tapped the folder. "This doesn't help anyone right now." Whitaker's shoulders sagged. "So we ignore it?" "We shelve it," Barnes corrected, setting the folder aside. "At least until someone higher up wants to see it." Later that day, back in his barracks quarters, Whitaker sat on the edge of his cot, the mattress springs groaning beneath him. He rubbed his temples, then pulled out his field journal. He turned past pages of combat logistics, fuel requests, and security memos until he reached a blank sheet. He wrote slowly. "Corporal Stein said something I can't forget. They let us write letters, but they can't write back. That is its own kind of punishment." He paused, then underlined it once. The sound of boots outside the hall interrupted his thoughts briefly, but he stayed still, lost in the silence between words. Later that week, more copies of the original intelligence report were distributed to upper offices. It was cited in briefings and used to justify reallocation of resources away from the camp. No one mentioned the suicide. No one sent penicillin. Whitaker's revision sat untouched in a drawer, its paper edges curling from the cold. He looked out the window once more. The snow had stopped, but the world remained white, hushed, untruthful. Not every lie is told aloud. Some are typed, signed, and stamped official. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of mercy, humanity, and moral contrast amid the brutality of war. Its purpose is to provoke thought about compassion in unexpected places and to inspire reflection on dignity, forgiveness, and shared humanity even between enemies.